Hi everyone. In this video I want to share some thoughts on moral relativism. So moral relativism is a philosophical belief system that holds that morality is determined by the context of the situation. People who believe in moral relativism believe that there are no universal moral codes, and again they believe that the context, the frame of reference through which you analyze the behavior is the determining factor in terms of its valuation. So let's break down morality in context, and then I'll talk about what I think are some useful implications from moral relativity, but then I also want to talk about where I think it can go wrong. So let's talk about morality. The definition that I'm going to go with is just the set of principles that govern the valuation of a behavior. We could also think about morality in terms of determining whether or not ideas or thoughts are good or bad, if we accept that ideas and thoughts can lead to certain behaviors. And when we're talking about morality and the goodness of and badness of behaviors, we can also talk about the goodness and badness of perceptions, because from a psychological perspective, there's not really a difference between, or I should say that differently, perception and action are complementary dynamics in terms of how we go about navigating the world. And so just think about visual perception. When you're looking around the world, or when you want to look at an object, I'm looking at this camera right here, my eyes are actually moving, my head is actually moving, my eyes, which are in my head, which are on a part of my neck, which is a part of my larger torso. To perceive something is also to maneuver your body in a way that allows you to interpret whatever sense data it is that you're trying to observe. And the way that you perceive the world determines how you act in the world, and then how you act in the world determines what you see. And so there's this perception action loop that's always going on. And so I think that's an interesting key aspect to note when we're talking about good and bad behavior and good and bad action, is that there's also the flip side of that in terms of good and bad perceptions. So morality being the set of principles that determine whether or not something's good, whether or not a behavior, a thought, or idea, a perception is good. So context. Again, moral relativists say that, well, the principles that we derive that govern the goodness of a behavior, for shorthand for all those other things I just said, come from the context. So what is a context? We could think of a context as the interpretive framework through which you analyze the world, the behavior, the perception. Some examples would be goals or intentions. And so here you can have either a deontological or consequentialist form of ethics, where you have deontological ethics, which says that some behaviors are good or bad no matter what. It sounds like an objective morality. And then you have consequentialist ethics, which says that, well, the goodness of a behavior depends on its outcome and the results that were produced because of the behavior. So from the consequentialist perspective, if you tell a white lie and people's feelings are spared and a more peaceful engagement is facilitated, then perhaps the white lie could be a good thing. Now, if there's a white lie and things get worse, then from that perspective, the context of the suboptimal outcomes is what determines the valuation of the white lie. And so in that latter instance, the white lie would be bad. So you could say that consequentialism is a form of this moral relativism, or hopefully that's just an example of how the context, in this case being the results, determines the valuation of the behavior. I've also heard of people using the context of different identity factors. So your race, your sex, your sexual orientation, your religion, and then culture also gets brought up there. Culture is an interesting term, and so that's why I hesitate to use it. But people will say, well, your past experience, some biological factors, how you grew up, how your parents raised you, your friends that you surround yourself with, that colors how you see the world. And so from a moral relativist perspective, we have to take into account people's capacity for different interpretations given different contexts when we're trying to assess the behavior or the valuation of a behavior. So I hope that all made sense, that there's a from a philosophical perspective, or even deeper, like a psychological perspective, we see the world through a lens, through an interpretive framework. We can't see the world entirely, and so we have a frame of reference through which we filter the essentially endless sense data that's around us. And that frame of reference determines, in large part, what the meaning is of that sense data. And then in this case, we're talking about morality. It determines the valuation of the behavior. So moral relativism is useful in the sense that it gets you to acknowledge that we do see the world through a context, and there are different contexts through which we can see the world. And that means that there's more than one way to observe a behavior or analyze the situation. And that can be helpful. I think one of the primary points of psychotherapy is to help people understand that they're interpreting the world a certain way in some cases, and some of their suffering might be a consequence of how they're interpreting the world. And the psychotherapeutic process, in part, is the process of discovering new, more optimal ways of interpreting the world. And that's a key point. We'll get back to that in a second. But it's useful to initially recognize that the way that you're looking at the world right now is not the only way that you could look at the world. And there might even be better ways that you could look at the world that could help alleviate some of your suffering. And this also goes into politics and socio-cultural factors, where from the perspective of moral relativism, they acknowledge that how, for example, we in the West have grown up, how we in America have grown up, even I grew up in Atlanta. With that context comes a certain set of norms. And when I go somewhere different geographically, or when I encounter someone who is not from my same culture, they see the world differently. And it's an interesting question to think about, well, whose way of seeing the world is correct, or is there even a correct way of seeing the world? And from my understanding, the moral relativists would say no. Different cultures, different cultural contexts, for example, cannot be judged as being good or bad when compared to each other. The same would go for belief systems and different religious ways of looking at the world. They're all equal in valuation, but they're just different. So again, moral relativism can be useful in that it helps you recognize that you see the world through a context, and that there are different contexts and interpretations that you can bring to bear on the world. Now, what I brought up earlier with psychotherapy, the one of the underlying assumptions with psychotherapy is that there are maladaptive ways of interpreting the world, and then there are adaptive ways of interpreting the world. And that's something that goes against moral relativism. If we're talking about ways of interpreting the world, the context, the frameworks, the cultural context that I mentioned before, I don't think that the moral relativists would agree that that's true. And that's where I think they're wrong. I think that there are definitely better and worse ways of looking at the world, which is the same thing as saying that there are better and worse contexts that you can use to analyze a given situation. Part of the moral relativistic problem that I see is that if you're saying that the goodness of a behavior is dependent on the context, well, then how do you select the context that is most appropriate? Or is there even such a thing as selecting an appropriate context to observe a behavior? And if there is no such thing as an appropriate context, because all contexts are evaluated equally, they're just different, well, then that allows you, in some sense, some very real sense, to take all the meaning out of behavior. If I'm watching myself act, part of what I want to do is I want to behave in a manner that allows me to not suffer unnecessarily. And sometimes those behaviors will be small habits or like little micro actions here or there. And some of those micro actions will be things that I can just kind of ignore, or sometimes I can even rationalize and justify to myself that it's okay that I do those behaviors. And part of the way I can do that is if I just shift the context. similar to the white lie example I gave before, there are many ways that we can shift our frame of reference in a manner that's actually worse for us. We can be doing something that, let's say most people would say is a bad behavior or is immoral or something that's just not good for us and it's not good for those around us. But it doesn't take much imagination to think that there is a context out there somewhere that would make that behavior moral or acceptable, at least. And so what's to stop me from just shifting to that context in my mind and using that as my interpretive structure? And so I think that's a pitfall of moral relativism. And I don't think that it's the proper way to think about how we're supposed to organize our behaviors and perceptions, either psychologically or sociologically. I'm of the opinion that there's an intrinsic order in the world, and human beings, conscious creatures, animals, life is a part of that intrinsic order. And when you deviate from that intrinsic order, you suffer unnecessarily. Life suffers. Conscious organisms suffer. I hope you understand what I'm saying. So, while I agree that there are multiple contexts that you can use to interpret a situation, I think that there is a pattern of optimal context selection when it comes to interpreting behavior. And I think that that pattern is grounded in something outside of humanity, something outside of consciousness. I think it's grounded in that intrinsic order. And that might be the topic for another video. But I just don't see any other way to avoid cynicism and nihilism if you carry the philosophy of moral relativism to its ultimate conclusion. From my understanding, moral relativism doesn't hold that there are certain behaviors that are absolutely immoral, that are inherently, objectively immoral. Objective might not be the right term. That might not be the best term. Let's just say inherently immoral. And so raping innocent women or murdering people, again, innocent, or any of the atrocities in the 20th century, any of the malevolence that was perpetrated by anyone who's evil. It's as if the reality of evil and pain and suffering is not something that's inherent or objective. It's something that is dependent on the context. And for me, I just disagree with that, and I don't think that that's a useful way to look at the world. And one example that I will just give was one of the things I'm studying in my graduate program is trauma. And part of the way that you can conceptualize trauma is when you're traumatized, part of your interpretive structure through which you look at the world is dissolved. And what that means is that the infinite potential or the chaos of reality comes flooding into you. And so you don't know how to navigate the world, and your nervous system knows that what you thought was true previously is no longer true. And so perhaps you thought that the world was a good place, or that people were good, or that you were innocent. Perhaps you believed that everything in the world was meaningful and had a purpose, and there's no randomness in the world. Well, what happens when people encounter tragedy or malevolence, or they see themselves engage in something malevolent, that initial assumption that they had about the world gets dissolved. That context that they had gets destroyed because they can't account for what they thought was true and this traumatic experience that they went through. And so one of the symptoms of PTSD is re-experiencing. And so the traumatic experience kind of floods their mind every now and again, frequently, intermittently. Either they have intrusive thoughts, intrusive images, or nightmares. And part of what this is your nervous system, or the trauma victim's nervous system, essentially undergoing some form of auto exposure therapy, trying to get the individual to rebuild a new schema or rebuild a new interpretive framework, now accounting for that new experience, so that way they can have a better understanding of the world and they can move forward. It's trying, your nervous system is trying to get you to learn. So what's the point that I'm trying to convey here? There are some contexts that, if you adopt them, will make you more likely to be traumatized if you encounter something tragic or if you encounter malevolence. And so for me, unless you think that getting traumatized is irrelevant or it doesn't really matter, that implies a value hierarchy in terms of the way that we interpret the world, and not all interpretations are equal. And there are some interpretations that are more adaptive, that will help you navigate the world and will ideally reduce the amount of unnecessary suffering that you have to endure. All right, I'm going to end it there. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.